Jy's ingeskakel op GROOTplaas en ons gas saam met ons vanoggend Wandile Sihlobo en hy is die Hoofekonoom en van die Landboubesigheidsvertrouensindeks van Suid-Afrika, beter bekend as Agbiz. Wandile, good morning and welcome.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
So you recently spoke at the conference about challenges facing South African agriculture. Looking back, what was the biggest message you wanted the delegates to take away from this?
I mean, look, I think the message was really mixed. The first one being that at a broad level, we have a sector that is doing reasonably well, but we should not get carried away with that. We must understand that we are standing on very fragile ground, and there are a number of subsectors that are under pressure. One of them being the livestock industry, beef and the dairy industry, still struggling with the effects of a foot and mouth disease, pork producers with the African swine fever, but also some of the long-standing challenges that relate to municipalities that are not performing well and presenting a higher transaction costs for agribusinesses and the farmers, but also a government that is not moving with the speed that we need in terms of registering new seed cultivars and certain farming inputs. Those are some of the challenges that I think to an extent hinder our growth prospect. But of course, we do have also a bit of a bright lights that are related to the higher grain harvest that we are expecting, higher fruit and vegetable harvest, albeit there has been some issues at the ports. That was a mixed and a broad message that I was putting forward there, wanting the delegates and many other folks to reflect on when thinking about where agriculture is.
So, Wandile, the latest Agbiz IDC agribusiness confidence index dropped to 45, the lowest it's been in 2 years. What do you believe is driving the growing pessimism in the sector?
On the backdrop of that mixed farming conditions that I've just painted, I think the sentiment is also changing. The South African farmers and agribusinesses are increasingly more pessimistic about the operating conditions in the country. There are a number of factors that we all understand that are driving some of this pessimism. And you can think about some of these having to do, for example, with the issue of the war in the Middle East that is adding to some of the rise in the input costs. And we also have a challenge, of course, that is related to some of these animal diseases that I was talking about, but also inefficiencies in the ports. Because we talk about the exports that South Africa is able to export and do all of these good things in the world market. But the reality is that we also sit in a country whereby if you were producing table grapes in Kakamas, you would have ideally exported some in Cape Town, and now the farmers had to move some of these products to far places such as the ports in the Eastern Cape because of the inefficiencies at the ports. So when you think about how the sentiment is changing in the sector, it's a combination of those, the higher input costs, inefficiencies at the ports, municipalities not delivering well, but also then the general animal diseases that remain an issue, even though we are, of course, making progress in terms of the vaccine procurement today compared to the start of the year.
Now, despite the negative confidence levels, we're still seeing some strong harvests, like you mentioned earlier, rising exports, more agricultural jobs. How do you explain this contrast between confidence and actual performance?
I think what we are seeing here is exactly the contrasting and the mixed performance that the South African agricultural sector is seeing this year, and also what we observed in 2025, which is that we have a sector that has broad subsectors, which is the field crops, grain, oil seeds and sugarcane, all of those benefiting from the La Nina rains, and to an extent that we are observing record harvests in some of those. Fruit and vegetables also benefiting from the favorable rains that we are seeing record harvests, although there has been some disruptions, of course, in the Western Cape and parts of the Eastern Cape because of the recent floods. But I think those are the ones that are pushing up the yields. It's because of those La Nina rains. And also even on the issue of the exports, I mean, the exports have been good in the first quarter, for example, of this year, we exported about $3.7 billion of agricultural products, up 11% from the same period last year. And remember, we were not building on low base because 2025 was an excellent year where we exported about $15.1 billion of agricultural products. So it's been a good activity on that. But that doesn't take away from the fact that animal diseases underpin the slow growth in the livestock industry. And the farmers in the fruits, they are not getting rich because of that big crop, because some incurred cost of having to transport their products to far places because the Port of Cape Town faced some of the inefficiencies. These are some of the dynamics that we are all seeing, and we see these as perhaps maybe really constraining the activity, which is why when you are looking at the sentiment, then you will see that the sentiment is going down while there are some figures that are going up. And as a result of that big harvest, though, this is why even the jobs numbers are holding strongly. We still have around 960,000 people that are working in farming, far above the average long-term jobs that are around 800,000. So that mixture, I think it really mirrors those dynamics and their varying performances.
Wandile, we're going to be back with you in a second. Dis ons gas op GROOTplaas vanoggend. Wandile Sihlobo, hy is een van die hoofekonome by Agbiz. Ons is terug op GROOTplaas net hierna. Jy is ingeskakel op GROOTplaas en ons gas saam met ons vanoggend Wandile Sihlobo, hy is hoofekonoom by Agbiz. Ons gesels 'n bietjie oor hulle laaste kongres en alles wat bespreek is daarso. So the conflict in the Middle East is something that you've mentioned, Wandile, and this has obviously had a massive ripple effect, especially in agriculture, through higher fuel prices, fertilizer, shipping costs, etc. How exposed is the South African agricultural sector to these types of issues?
The South African farming sector is very exposed to the difficulties of the Middle East through imports of various inputs, fertilizer, fuel being the main ones in our sector, but also on exports. Remember, as a country, we import roughly about 80% or so of the fertilizer that we use. So with all of the shocks and the rise in the fertilizer prices, that's something that is a challenge. And if you're thinking about typical crops in South Africa, fertilizer typically accounts for anywhere between 20 to 30% of their input cost, and fuel is also a substantive share of that. So this is something we worry about ahead of the start of the 2026-27 production season from October. In terms of the exports, though, the Middle East is also important because they account for roughly 8% of South Africa's agricultural exports. So when there are all of these disruptions in the shipping lines and also just the rise in shipping costs, that is something that also we worry about because we send fruit, red meat, as well as grains in some markets in the Middle East, and that's the main concern at the moment.
Wandile, now we had a few guests on the show already, and one of the things that they mentioned is import tariff responses that are quite delayed, also creating additional pressure for our farmers. What policy changes would you like to see from government to better support our producers?
I mean, look, I do think that the issues of tariffs and the calibration of them, particularly on the issue of wheat that I think many people have complained about, as well as on the sugar side, there's always a difficulty on this because if you are sitting as a government, let's say at ITEC, the International Trade Administration Commission, you're balancing consumer welfare as well as the producer welfare. And I think calibrating that pathway carefully is something that everyone ought to achieve. But I think timing of all of this is something that can be enhanced because it is true that there's been excessive delays on some of these related to the processes of how the tariffs in South Africa gets to be implemented, as well as the administrative bodies that are available on that. I sit on one of those, particularly at high tech. And I think that the speed is something that we're very concerned about, and we need to make sure that it's enhanced so that whatever adjustments are happening, they happen and they respond to an actual issue that is confronting the industry, not to be delayed. By the time the response happens, the market conditions have already significantly changed.
Wandile, always a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Dis ons gas op GROOTplaas, Wandile Sihlobo. Hy is die hoofekonoom by Agbiz. Dis al waarvoor ons tyd het vir GROOTplaas vanoggend. Ons hoop jy het dit saam met ons geniet en dan kuier ons weer môre.